Hi everyone, and welcome to this week 2 session. Today we're going to be looking at research paradigms, and we're going to be digging a bit deeper into research itself, what it is, what knowledge is, how we come to construct it, and those types of things. We're going to be covering a lot of things, and some I'm going to look at in quite a superficial way. A lot of the debates we're going to be having have been going on literally for centuries. We're not doing a degree in philosophy here, so we're just going to look at the broad landscape in this session. We're not really going to dig into some of the depth. There's going to be a lot more to say about many of the things we cover, but you need to have a broad understanding of the arguments, and that's what hopefully this video is going to give you. So notions of knowledge and other aspects of research are really quite deeply philosophical. And this is why many doctoral degrees are considered to be PhDs or Doctors of Philosophy. Even if the main focus is going to be something like music or education, it's still considered a philosophy degree because we're dealing with notions of reality and notions of knowledge. So these are really very complex areas, and in many ways they're highly disputed. There's not a single answer or a single truth. So many of these things are going to come down to belief. So when you're watching this video, you don't necessarily need to agree with any of the things that I'm saying. And at times I'm going to put forward ideas which are coming from two different perspectives, and it's up to you to choose which one you agree with. I'm not giving my opinion. I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible here. I'm trying to outline the contours of the arguments for you so you can start to come to your own conclusions on what you believe. Another warning here is just to say that I'm not trained in philosophy. However, I kind of keep abreast of the arguments, and I've read quite a lot around these things. However, if you've got a background in philosophy, you might find some of the arguments I'm putting forward are a little bit two-dimensional, or there might be more to say. As I've said, we can't dig into the depth of them here. So just be aware, I'm giving you the outline, the contours of the arguments as much as possible. Finally, I just want to say, hopefully you've already started to engage with the Conan-Mannion chapter, that first chapter. Some of you might be finding that challenging. Hopefully this video is going to help you understand what some of the arguments, some of the points are which are being made in that document. So, following on from these warnings, let's get started, and we're going to begin with what seems like a very simple question. What's the actual point of doing research? On one level, the pragmatic answer is that the core component of your master's degree. You need to do that. It's a thing that you have to do at master's level. You have to engage with the research. But I think the real answer is a little bit more fundamental than that. I want you to think about your own professional lives as musicians and as educators. You're constantly engaged in an informal kind of research. I'm guessing very often you're asking yourself questions like, why aren't my students grasping this? Or what could I do to improve how I'm teaching? Or what's the impact of this music project that I'm leading on the participants? So at its heart, research is about a desire to understand the world more deeply. It's about moving beyond our own hunches, our gut feelings and our personal experiences to find something that's more robust or solid, to find kind of deeper answers. Really importantly here, it goes beyond just those hunches by becoming a formal, structured process. It's about finding a way of systematically asking questions and trying to find answers to those questions. So, before we dive into the how of research, we're going to anchor ourselves in this kind of why question, why we're doing research. So hopefully this slide starts to give us a bit of a working definition that we can use throughout this module regarding what research actually is. I'll give you a second just to read the text. Okay, we're going to break it down because every word here is important. Firstly, it's a systematic process. This is key in that it distinguishes academic research from everyday inquiry. It's not random, it's not you going home after a session and just kind of broadly thinking about it. It's planned, it's methodical, and it's deliberate. It implies that we have carefully thought through how we'll try to answer our questions. Second, its purpose is for creating new knowledge. And it's important to distinguish this from search, as in simply reading books and learning as an individual. Now, obviously, reading books is a vital part of your own development, but it's not primary research in the academic sense. What we're talking about here in these sessions is primary knowledge creation, the active process of generating genuinely new insights, new interpretations, or new understandings. And finally, it extends what we know, and this is absolutely crucial. Your research does not exist in a vacuum. It's designed to add to what's known by humanity already. But, and this is really important, we are not expecting a theory of relativity here. We're not expecting huge amounts of data, huge ideas. Typically, a contribution to knowledge, especially at master's level, is something very, very specific and focused. We're thinking of a very, very small piece of information that you're adding to the global conversation, as opposed to something that's like a paradigm change. Okay. As we can see, these core ideas are reflected in how experts in the field actually formally define the term. So, on the slide at the moment, the well-known educational researcher John Creswell defines research as a process of steps used to collect and analyze information to increase our understanding of a topic or issue. So you'll see that this is very similar to the definition on the last slide. Again, notice key elements are very similar in terms of a process of steps, which is our systematic part, the goal of increasing our understanding, which is about creating knowledge and extending knowledge. So, hopefully we have a working definition at this point of what research is. Perhaps just think that through, make sure you're comfortable with that. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to pop those into a forum. But assuming we've got that working definition, we're now going to dive into some bigger questions about what research is and knowledge is. So, the first question is this: how can you be sure that you know anything? So if research is a systematic process for creating knowledge, we have to ask exactly what we mean by knowledge. And on what basis can we claim to know anything? And this is where our philosophical journey is about to begin. I want you to stop the video just for a few minutes and think about this, because it's a huge question. It might seem simple at first, but if you dig into this, this is a question that philosophers have been dealing with actually for centuries, if not millennium. So hopefully you stopped the video. I don't know what your thoughts were about this or where you got to, but I'm going to start to push this to some of the extreme conclusions. So the first one is that it's difficult to be sure that you know anything. Now, when I say it's difficult to know that you know anything, we could dig this as far as it's very difficult to know anything, including that even you exist. Now, this might sound absurd, something for a late night debate in a student dorm, but it's genuinely a profound problem that philosophers and even scientists not only have been grappling with for centuries, but are actually still grappling with. For instance, here are some thought experiments you might want to consider. Let's start with this one. Can you be absolutely sure that you weren't born as a fully grown adult when you awoke this morning, with a complete set of fabricated memories of a life you never actually lived? So imagine that your dreams are actually you being created. You woke up, but nothing had happened yesterday. You weren't here yesterday. Reality started this morning when you awoke. So in this context, your memories would feel real, but they only exist in your mind right now. And actually, you have no way of stepping outside of your own consciousness to verify them. Let's take this a little bit further. What's to say that you're not a tree dreaming that you're a human? So this could entirely be a dream. Or indeed, if you weren't a tree, you could be an entirely different life form, or even consciousness itself, imagining that you're a human. Or, if we want to use a more modern example, how do you know you're not in an incredibly advanced simulation, a bit like the film Matrix? And you'll realise that many of these kind of debates and ideas are really strongly happening in contemporary society. So we're dealing with this right now as a philosophical content of debate. So even contemporary science throws doubt on many of these things and how much we can be sure we are what we think we are. So some thinkers, like the cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman, argue that evolution has shaped our senses, not to perceive actual reality, but provide us with a simplified interface that helps us survive. So we don't see the world as it truly is. Instead, we're seeing a useful illusion of it. Essentially, we're left in a state of radical doubt. If you can't trust your senses, your memories, or even your perception of the world, is there anything left that you can know for certain? Is there a single, unshakable foundation we as humans can build on? Because if not, any claims of truth become entirely absurd and meaningless. And this is a really, really critical thought that many philosophers have grappled with. If we can't be sure we even exist in the form that we think we do, then all other knowledge starts to become questionable at best. So, it's exactly from this place of doubt that the 17th century French philosopher René Descartes started to think about what he could be sure of. And his answer to that very question of, is there anything I can be certain of, is arguably one of the most famous philosophical phrases. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The genius of this statement is its simplicity and its power. Descartes realized that even if everything else was an illusion, the very act of him doubting his own existence was itself the one thing he could not doubt. He reasoned, I can doubt that my body is real, I can doubt the world around me is real, I can even imagine that a powerful evil demon is dedicating all of its energy to deceiving me about everything. But in order to be deceived, or to doubt, or to think at all, there must be an I who is doing the thinking. It all requires a thinker. A doubt requires a doubter. The act of thinking itself proves the existence of a self that is thinking. And for Descartes, this became the one single indestructible truth. It was the bedrock, the foundation, the starting point of certain from which he believed he could begin to systematically rebuild all of human knowledge. So Descartes gives us this seemingly solid foundation. I think, therefore I am. And you might feel, actually, this feels very, very good to me. This feels like we start to have established a foundation. But we can start to pull it apart. And the place you might want to start is with the notion of what is this I? For Descartes, the I was a non-physical mind, a thinking substance, a consciousness, perhaps even a soul, that was entirely separated from a physical body. And this idea is famously known as Cartesian duality. It's the mind-body split. If you're interested in philosophy, you're going to find out about this quite quickly, and it's going to be hotly debated in the books you read. For him, the I, the conscious part of the self, and the body are separate. The body's more like a machine that the consciousness inhabits. But for us as musicians, that separation might not really seem to hold up. There are contemporary ideas around embodied knowledge now, and that's the idea that there isn't a simple division between consciousness and body. For instance, when you play your instrument, you undertake complex movements, but very often you're doing that without conscious thought. And we could argue that this is a form of knowledge itself, and importantly, that this form of knowledge is held within the body itself. So can we really separate the thinking I from the physical experiencing I? However, just to pull this apart a little bit further, both Descartes' perspective and that of embodied knowledge still somewhat rests on an atomized version of a singular self. Whether that's the mind separated from the body or the mind and the body combined, there's still a singular I. Now this is a very Western idea, and it's challenged by more Eastern traditions, where they quite often consider the I of a self from a very different perspective. From those traditions, there's a much stronger self of interconnectedness, or sense of interconnectedness, of consciousness as a universal field that we're all part of. From that perspective, the idea of a separate, isolated I might be seen as more of an illusion. And this links to even very contemporary philosophical theories. For instance, panpsychism. Panpsychism proposes that consciousness isn't something special that happens only in brains, but is a fundamental property of everything in the universe. If this were the case, then my personal I isn't so special. It's just a small part of a much larger universal consciousness, shared by everything ranging from potentially a single atom right the way through to the collective consciousness of something as big as the sun. So we can see Descartes' brilliant solution starts to look a little bit shaky. Is the I a mind? Is it a body? Is it both? Or is it just a byproduct of thinking of universal consciousness? His solution, while powerful, isn't necessarily the only or correct one. But for the sake of this argument, we're going to follow his line of reasoning. Let's assume there is a singular I that exists purely as a thinking mind. If that's the only thing I can be sure of, where does that idea take us? And does it really lead us to somewhere solid? So, we're going to build on this idea of a thinking mind. And we're going to see very quickly that actually it can lead us down a bit of a rabbit hole. To be very specific, we can find ourselves in a lonely philosophical position called solipsism. So the British philosopher F.H. Bradley captured its essence perfectly in the quote you'll see on this slide. Appearance and reality, he wrote. I cannot transcend my experience, and experience must be my experience. So from this it follows that nothing beyond myself exists. Let's unpack this because it's a powerful piece of logic. What he's saying is that every sight, every sound, every thought, every emotion you've ever had only occurred inside your own mind. You have never for a single second directly experienced anything outside of your own consciousness. Your world exists in the dark silence of your mind within your skull. And you can't step outside of your own head to check if the world is really there, independently of you. If you accept this premise, then the only strictly logical conclusion is that your mind and its content are the only things that are real. Therefore, reality is a subjective experience. And this is a really critical idea. The idea that reality is subjective is an idea that we'll be returning to a lot during this course, and it defines certain types of research that we'll be exploring. And this, of course, leads to the next inevitable and rather uncomfortable question. Can I, from within my purely subjective reality, be sure, for instance, that you exist? Are you a conscious thinking being with your own inner world of thoughts and feelings? Or are you just a very sophisticated figment of my imagination, a kind of avatar which I've created, a character perhaps in my own private dream? From a purely solipsistic viewpoint, there is no way for me to prove it one way or another. Now, clearly living as a purely solipsist isn't very practical. It's a logical, coherent position, but it's also a bit of a philosophical dead end. We'll struggle to think about things like building society or running a university or teaching music in a class if there's an idea that we are the only real us. Unless we really want to double down and think of our external reality as an externalized projection of our inner world, reality starts to break down from that perspective. So to move forward, both in this lecture and in life, we have to make a choice. We need to make a pragmatic leap of faith. We need to decide to act as if other people are real and are conscious. So for the rest of our discussion, I'm going to ask you to agree to something, and I'll agree to the same thing, which is to assume that you exist, and for you hopefully to assume that I exist. And then we'll start to move this argument forward a bit. So it seems like we've made that leap of faith, but even after I accept that you're real conscious being, we immediately run into a new and perhaps even more fascinating problem. And it's this question that's on the slide. Can I be sure your experience of reality is the same as mine? So now we've moved the problem from one of existence to a problem of shared experience. For example, is the experience I have when I see the colour red the same as the experience that you have? Or when we both listen to a piece of music and describe it as sad, are we actually feeling the same internal emotions? And there's a fundamental question. It might be that are we all perceiving and constructing the world differently based upon our own set of ideas and experiences? This is the foundation to the next major philosophical paradigm we need to understand, which again adds further meat onto the bones of a subjective or subjectivist view of reality. It brings us onto the notion of idealism. This is the formal home philosophically of a question we just asked. Is your experience of reality the same as mine? At its core, idealism proposes that reality as we know it is fundamentally mental or based on consciousness. The most famous expression of this comes from the philosopher George Berkeley, who stated simply, "To be is to be perceived." What he meant is that things only exist in the moment they're being experienced by mind. A tree in a forest only exists if someone or something, be it a person, an animal, or for Berkeley, the mind of God, if something is there to perceive it. This is a form of what's described as subjective idealism, the belief that reality is entirely a mental construct with no proof of a separate objective world. Now, there's a more moderate version of this, which is called objective idealism, and this view accepts that there might be an objective external reality out there, but it argues that we can never access it directly. We only ever perceive it through our own filtered minds, our own consciousness, our own set of ideas. So even if a real world exists, we each construct our own version of it. And you'll notice that word construct is important, and it links to the philosophical underpinnings of the educational idea of constructivism. And again, this isn't just an old philosophical debate. It's actually really present in modern cognitive science. As I mentioned earlier, someone like Donald Hoffman, he's arguing currently that our senses have not evolved to show us the truth of reality, but rather they've evolved to give us a useful interface for survival itself. So he argues we see a highly simplified, constructed view of reality that helps us to live, not one that actually shows us what's truly out there. So I just want us to pause at this point, and we're going to recap because we're going to move on to a completely opposite view of this in a second. But before we do, let's have a little recap of where we've got to. So we began with this notion of radical doubt. We questioned everything. Is there anything we can be sure of? We found one potential point of certainty, with Descartes thinking about the I, and we saw how this can lead to a lonely construction of solipsism, that my mind is the only reality. And then we've kind of opened it up a little bit, and we've landed on the idea of idealism, the idea that reality is fundamentally shaped by, or simply is, in our mind and ideas. This entire family of ideas, from Descartes to idealism, represents what we call in research a subjectivist approach to reality. It places human consciousness and individual experience at the very centre of what is real. But this is only, as I said, one side of a very old and kind of deep philosophical debate. For every one of these ideas, there's a powerful and for many far more common sense way of opposing it. So we're now going to look at the other side of that coin. So, the other side of this great philosophical chess match is that it starts not, or our view of reality should not start with the inner world of our minds, but rather with the external world around us. The foundation of this opposing view is very simple. And for many of you, it's going to be kind of deeply intuitive. It's a claim that there is an objective reality. I just want you to think about that because it's really important. There's a notion that there is something objective outside of ourselves that is real. So, if we're going to start from this position, we have to have a belief that the world exists out there, completely independent of us, our minds, our feelings, or our consciousness. And the sun in this slide is kind of a perfect example. We might make a statement like, the sun rises every day. It feels to us like a fundamental fact it's true. And it feels like it's going to be true whether we're here to see it or not. It feels like it's going to have been true long before any of us existed. And it also feels like it's going to continue to be true long after we are gone. The reality of the sun rising doesn't need us to perceive it for it to continue to be true. But this view, the view of an objective reality, goes further. It doesn't just say that reality exists. It says something more. It suggests something more. It suggests that reality is ordered and that it's predictable. It suggests there's a degree of certainty to the laws that govern reality. Think of something like modern physics. Think of an idea like gravity or motion. These things are seen as consistent, as universal rules that structure the universe. They're not things that are matters of opinion or perspective. They're stable and they're reliable. And if we're thinking about research and there is an ordered objective reality, then our role as researchers becomes clear. Our role is to determine what those laws that underpin reality are. What are those stable, consistent things? Now, in one way, this is a profoundly optimistic view of knowledge, and it positions the researcher as a neutral observer who, through careful, systematic investigation, can uncover universal truths about how the world works. This entire worldview is the foundation of what most of us think of as modern science. So, let's build upon this. Let's imagine and let's assume that we have this real objective reality. So the next absolutely critical claim is this: how can we come to know it? So for much of human history, the answers were found in religious texts or through pure logical reasoning. Like the Greek philosophers or like Descartes, we had people thinking about what might be true. But starting around the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a bit of a revolution. We got thinkers like Francis Bacon in England who began to champion a new and at the time radical idea. And this is the idea of empiricism. So empiricism is the belief that genuine knowledge can only be derived from what we experience through our senses. It's the idea that truth isn't found by looking inward at our own reason, but rather by looking outwardly into the world. You don't deduce how the world should be, rather you go out and you observe how it actually is. You measure it, you test it, you experiment on it. This was a really fundamental shift that gave birth to modern science. It's the belief that our senses are our bridge between the mind and the objective reality that's out there. This core principle of empiricism, that knowledge comes from sense experience, started to become developed into a complete philosophy of science by the 19th century thinker Auguste Comte, and he called this idea positivism. As you'll see on the slide, for positivism, it says knowledge is based on sense experience, which can be advanced by means of observations. Comte's big idea was that we could and should study society and human behaviour with the same rigour that we use to study the natural world. He argued that if we want to create positive meaning and certain factual knowledge, we must base it only on things that can be directly observed and verified. Anything else, like theology, metaphysics, or a subjective feeling, was considered to be speculation, not true knowledge. This positivist approach, this commitment to observable, empirical evidence, leads to two really incredibly powerful goals for research. The first is the idea of reliability, which is strongly linked to an idea of replicability. If we're going to discover genuine objective laws that govern reality, then our findings must be able to be repeated. Our results should lead to predictive results. Essentially, reality is the way of predicting the future. If we're in this context and we have these things happening, we should be able to predict what will happen next. So just as a chemist can predict that mixing two chemicals will always cause the same reaction, a positivist researcher in education would hope to find things that, using a particular teaching method, let's say, will reliably lead to predictable improvements in student outcomes. The next important thing here is this idea of generalizability. Because the underlying laws, if we believe in an objective reality, are universal, or of human behaviour in a positive view, we have to assume that there are universal truths. There are things to be discovered through specific controlled experiments that could be applicable much more broadly. So the idea is not that there are separate realities, but that there are universal truths or universal things that we can generalize across populations, across all contexts. The goal isn't just to find out what works in this one classroom, but is going to be to discover principles that can be applied to any or all classrooms. So, building on these two ideas, we've established that for positivist research, we should have a reliability which will lead to prediction, and we should have generalizability, this idea of universal results. Now, for this to be true, for us to have this certainty, we need to now develop another idea, and it's the idea of causal relationships. The world of chemistry gives us a really, really perfect example of this and what we mean by causality. So let's take the most simple example. Let's imagine we have chemical A and we have chemical B, and we mix them together under very controlled conditions. If those controlled conditions remain the same and chemical A and chemical B are mixed together, you would assume you will always get result C, whatever that is. That might be an explosion or something, let's imagine. This isn't a coincidence. Our rules, as we outlined, is that if there's an objective reality, we are going to have predictable and replicable outcomes. From that, we can deduce that one thing directly causes the other. Chemical A mixed with chemical B causes reaction C. This is probably the simplest form of a cause and effect that we can find. And for positivists, this is the gold standard of knowledge. The goal of research is to find clear causal links in the world. For this reason, Much research attempts to find isolated single relationships of cause and effect. So it's for that reason we're not thinking about these huge paradigm shifts, these whole things like Einstein's theory of relativity that brings lots of different things together. We're not thinking in those ways in our research. We're thinking about very tiny, very isolated facts. We're thinking about how can we draw out small things and see what happens when they're brought together. But we also need to make a very clear distinction here. And this is arguably one of the most important distinctions we can make in research. We have to be really careful not to confuse a causal link with a correlation. So the classic example is lung cancer. So through decades of biological research, we've established a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. The chemicals in cigarette smoke directly cause cellular damage, which leads to cancer. This is a very clear cause and effect. However, there is also a very strong correlational link between having yellow stained fingers and having lung cancer. People with yellow fingers get lung cancer at a much higher rate than people without it. But we have to ask ourselves, do the yellow fingers cause lung cancer? And we think, well, of course they don't. So both yellow fingers and lung cancer are caused by the same third factor, smoking. So this is a difference between a correlation and a causation. Yellow fingers do not cause lung cancer, but there is a correlation. We'll see yellow fingers more often in smokers, and therefore there's a correlation between yellow fingers and lung cancer. So research might attempt to look for both things. It might attempt to look for a causal relationship or a correlation. And both discoveries are considered worthwhile. They're both research outcomes. However, and this is really important, we have to be really very, very careful not to mistake a correlation for a causation. And it's one of the most common and dangerous errors interpreting research. And it's something you're going to have to really look out for when you're doing your work. Have you found a correlation, or can you be sure to move it up into the next area of what we might say is a causal link? Okay, so let's get back to this pure idea of a causal relationship, where A always and inevitably causes B. Because this also has some quite profound impacts or implications. When we take that idea and apply it not just to chemistry, but to everything in the universe, it leads us to a profound philosophical conclusion. This is that the belief, or underpinning this is a belief, that the world is governed by unbreakable chains of cause and effect. And if that's the case, then we might describe ourselves as living in a deterministic universe. Now, this might not seem like quite a big deal on the face of it, but the implications are really quite massive if we follow this through. So as I said, determination is the view that the universe and everything in it is just a vastly complicated machine, and it's predictable. It's like a watch. Once it's wound up, every single subsequent action is entirely predictable because it's the direct and unavoidable consequence of previous events. Now, as I said, the implications of this are really profound, especially when it's applied to humans. If there's determinism, every human act, every decision you think, everything that you think you are freely making, every choice, every decision, is actually an inevitable result of an unbreakable chain of prior causes. Everything from your genetics, your environment, the physics of your brain, everything is deterministic. And in this view, there is no free will. We're all, put simply, just cogs in a machine. This is devastating logically. and it comes directly from an objectivist view of reality. If we accept this view, this positivist's objectivist view of reality, the ultimate conclusion is that we have no free will. Without free will, we can start to think of things like ethics and morality as quite problematic. For instance, a criminal might argue that they're not guilty of a crime. They're merely an actor in a real-time play over which they essentially had no control. Without free will, identity and a host of other aspects of our individuality and arguably collective reality require rethinking, often in very non-intuitive ways. Now, this deterministic clockwork view of reality was a bedrock of science for a number of centuries. Indeed, in many ways it's kind of an aspiration of pure positivism. But it's been challenged more recently. And so in the 20th century we have philosophers such as Karl Popper who were really starting to think deeply about the implications of this. And alongside this, we started to have physics that started to question whether the universe is actually deterministic in the way that an objectivist might view it. And particularly quantum mechanics starts to really shatter this model. So at the subatomic level, we now know the universe doesn't seem to be a predictable machine at all. It appears to operate on probabilistic things, on chance even. So we might not live in a purely deterministic universe, but rather a probabilistic one where A doesn't always cause B, but merely increases the likelihood that B will happen. And this starts to open the door to other ways of viewing reality. And we'll start to see that there are people talking about notions of complexity, for instance, and different understandings of research that emerge from this. And I want to tie this back into this notion of generalizability. So we've gone through the idea that there might be an objective reality, and that if we're looking at that objective reality, there might be universal laws and there might be a predictability about it. And essentially that's what a positivistic research would do, would be to look for that would be to look for that certainty, the level of certainty. But now I just want to think about generalizability. Let's go back to our chemical A, chemical B idea, and assuming that the setting was kind of consistent, the context of that experiment was consistent. It wouldn't matter really if we did that experiment in Tokyo, in England, or necessarily even on Mars. We might assume that chemical A plus chemical B will always result in C. But this is very simplistic in some ways. These are isolated chemicals. And I now just want to think about the reality of doing social research. Is it possible to get this degree of simplification with people? So let's think, if we start to imagine humans and we start to think about a system of research like positivism, can we isolate humans in the same way? And I want to take it from the view of medicine. So we might think that something like medicine is ideal, because essentially we might be thinking a bit like chemical A, chemical B if we're looking at medicine. But even in medicine, the idea of perfect generalizability shows cracks. So pharmaceutical companies develop a new drug and they start to experiment, and they realize that it won't work the same way for every single person. And they'll actually expect that. They know that a chemical doesn't work or a drug doesn't work the same for everyone. It depends on your genetics, your age, your lifestyle, perhaps other medications you're taking. And all of these factors can affect an outcome of a drug. So we see this idea of a law in reality, so in a law of predictability or a law of generalizability, starts to look less universal, less certain. And if we move that from the relatively controlled world of medicine, and we start to think about the enormous complexity that is there if we enter a social space, like a classroom, we start to see the problems with this idea. In chemistry, you can potentially isolate out those chemicals, But in a classroom, what are the variability, or what are the variables? We might think about the teaching method as one. But what about the teacher's personality? What about the student's mood on a particular day we're going in? What about the time of day the class is held, or the cultural backgrounds or the backgrounds of the children more broadly? How about the school's specific ethos or policies? As we start to break it down, you start to see the list of different variables is essentially infinite. And it becomes impossible, or more or less almost impossible, to isolate a single cause to be the certain thing that causes an effect. And in that way, it becomes difficult to confidently generalize to other classrooms in other parts of the world. So let's take a concrete example. Let's think about Lucy Green's work. And we might think about employing informal learning practices to other settings. Now, her findings have been transformative for many teachers, but we have to ask about generalizability of her theories. Is her work a universal truth about how all humans learn music best? Or is it a culturally defined approach that's highly effective for students familiar with Western pop and rock traditions? For instance, could we generalize her ideas to a rural classroom in China, focused on traditional opera, or a class in India studying classical ragas? This is a fundamental challenge, and it's the difficulty of creating truly universal generalizable laws about complex human beings in complex social situations. And it's primarily the reason we need more than one approach to research. It forces us to decide upon the purpose of our study. Are we trying to find broad laws that apply to large groups, or are we trying to gain deep, rich understanding of a specific, unique situation? So, the question I left you with at the end of the last slide, are we trying to find broad laws for large groups or specific understandings, is so fundamental that we have specific terms for these two approaches. For the first, we have nomothetic research. It comes from the Greek word nomos for law, and this is that kind of generalizable research. It applies to broad populations. It's kind of coming out of that positivist paradigm. The goal really here is to average out individual quirks and find the underlying universal patterns. On the other hand, we have ideographic research, and this comes from the Greek of idios, meaning own or private. And here, the goal is the complete opposite. It's not about creating a universal law but it's rather about achieving a deep, rich, and holistic understanding of a particular individual or small group in a unique context. This approach values specific details, not general patterns. It often involves qualitative methods like in-depth interviews or observations. The researcher here might study a single community, let's say a specific community choir, but they're going to do it in great detail. So, I think we've got the broad idea, the broad landscape mapped out. I now just want to apply this to the reading that you've been doing over the last week or so. And we're going to look at the Cohen and Mannion book. So, in chapter 1, hopefully you've seen what I've got on my screen now. It's this grid or this table. Now, when you look at it, it might appear at first very dense and very intimidating, particularly because it's filled with a whole load of new terminology. But my hope is after this video, we can start to pull these philosophical ideas and traditions into a firmer understanding of what this page is actually showing us. So let's look at the two columns. They're representing the two opposing worldviews that we've been exploring. We've got that subjectivist one on one side, and we've got the objectivist one on the other. So, on the right-hand side, we have this objectivist approach to social science. And this is the entire philosophical family we've explored in the second half of our session. It's the worldview of the sunrise of empiricism, of the search for causal relationships. On the left-hand side, we have the subjectivist approach. This is the world of Descartes, of I, of solipsism, of idealism, where reality is seen as a personal, internal, and mentally constructed experience. And these are important additional terms we need to think about in this subjectivist column. I've touched upon them just in my explanation there. So the first is interpretivism. And interpretivism emphasizes that social reality is not a given, but that it's actively interpreted by individuals. The researcher's job here is to understand those interpretations. The second, you might have come across already, and I've mentioned it previously, is constructivism. And it's an idea which is strongly related. It emphasizes how individuals construct their understanding and knowledge of the world through experiencing things and reflecting on those experiences. So these terms, in a subjectivist approach to research, are really critical. You have to understand that this notion that we're interpreting and we're constructing reality. Now, these rows connect, and you'll see that we have terms on both columns that are connected. The first, ontology. Now, ontology looks at questions of reality. The objectivist view, as we said, is realism, the belief that there is a real tangible reality and that it exists out there, and as a researcher we can go out there and test it. Whereas the subjectivist view is called nominalism. It's the idea that we've touched on with idealism, that reality doesn't have a pre-existing structure. It's a world that we construct and we label through our own language and ideas. On the next row we have epistemology, and this is to do with knowledge. The objectivist approach, as we discussed at length, is one of positivism, that we gain knowledge by observing the external world, by measuring it, by looking at it for universal laws. The subjectivist approach is therefore anti-positivism. It argues that we can't study the social world in the same way we might chemistry. It argues that to understand human action, we need to understand the subjective meanings, interpretations, and motivations behind it. On the third row, we have human nature. Now, the objectivist's positive view, when taken to its logical conclusion, leads us to determinism. This idea of us all being merely cogs in a machine. The idea that all of our actions are caused by external forces. On the other side, the subjectivist view, by contrast, champions voluntarism. This is simply the belief in free will, that humans are conscious agents who make their own choices and create their own realities. And finally, on that final row, we have methodology. This is the practical approach we need to take doing research. And these are the last two terms we're going to discuss here. The objectivist, law-seeking approach is nomothetic. It looks at broad populations. Whereas subjectivist meaning is seeking an ideographic approach. It's focusing on deep understanding from specific cases, specific situations. You'll see this table isn't just a list of vocabulary. It is, but actually it's more than that. It's a map of logic. It's a map of different perspectives. It shows you that at your deepest, most fundamental level of belief, that it's going to shape your nature of reality, how you view what is real. And in turn, that's likely to determine the form of research that you will actually do. Understanding your own position on this map is really essential. It's the first and arguably the most important step in becoming critical and a self-aware researcher. You're also going to note that neither is perfect. Both comes with challenges, with philosophical issues. So while this diagram shows the two most dominant historical paradigms, it's also important to note there are places in the middle. For instance, if you've read the Conan Mannion, you might have come across critical theory. And critical theory is interested not just in understanding the world, so it's not about understanding necessarily, but more importantly, it's about a focus on changing the world. It focuses on issues of power, inequality, social justice, and it's very important and influential You're going to have heard about critical theory probably if you keep up to date with modern talks, more academic things in podcasts. You'll have come across this. And it's really essential. It's had a lot of impact on social science research, particularly on education. Just returning to the diagram itself, you'll see at the bottom I've added two other terms. At the very bottom, we've got qualitative and quantitative. And again, they're strongly associated with these two different objectivist and subjectivist ideas of reality. Qualitative research aligns with the subjectivist approach. And as we've already explained, it aims to explore rich, often personal experiences of individuals. And really importantly, it seeks to answer questions related to why or how. On the other side, on the objectivist idea, we've got quantitative research, and that's aligned to ideas and questions such as how much or how many. It's about measuring variables and looking for patterns across large groups. I also just want to step back a second and think about these in terms of two columns and this idea that everything is binary and oppositional. I want you to think about this. One side seems to be a rejection of the other. And I want you to question if you think this is actually the nature of reality. Do we have to live in this binary paradigm? So, thinking about this binary paradigm leads us on to another idea, the idea of pragmatism. And pragmatism is a philosophical perspective that suggests that we might be able to escape from this binary opposition, that we might not need to see things as oppositional. We might ask the question, why do I have to choose a side? Perhaps both of these approaches have values, so why can't I use the ones that work best for me in my specific paradigm, in my particular context? So, as the name suggests, pragmatism is practical rather than idealistic. It's not overly concerned with abstract debates about the ultimate nature of reality. Instead, it's practice driven. It starts with a real world problem and asks, what's the most effective way for me to understand and solve it? This makes it inherently open to singular and multiple versions of truth. A pragmatist would say that quantitative data can give us one valuable type of truth about a situation, while qualitative data can give us another equally valuable type. So they don't see this as contradictory, but they see it as complementary. Ultimately, a pragmatist's core view is utility. It's about what works. And that's the guiding principle. So it's not about what's correct, but it's more about what could I combine to be fit for purpose. And in terms of how this might manifest itself, we end up with a methodology that's called mixed methods research. Now we're going to do a specific section or a video particularly about mixed methods, but I just want to give a quick overview. So as its name implies, it's all about moving beyond silos. It's about intentionally mixing qualitative and quantitative approaches into a single study. So it's a sophisticated way of viewing the world. And it's more than just bringing together these labels. It's about thinking about the purpose of our research and thinking in terms of confirmatory or exploratory research. So confirmatory research, like a quantitative experiment, is often about testing a pre-existing hypothesis. Exploratory research, like a qualitative case study, is about discovering what is happening in a particular context and generating new ideas. So it's that kind of distinction between inductive and deductive research. So powerful mixed method study has the potential to do both. So you could explore a new teaching approach through qualitative classroom observations and then try to confirm the effectiveness of the outcomes through quantitative tests. As I said, we're going to look at this in a lot more detail, but we need to know where these ideas come from. So I just want to draw this to a conclusion because it's been a long video. And we're going to end on this slide, which is all about the language of research. Now, first, and really importantly, hoping you've got to this point because I know it's been a very full video, I want to acknowledge that the video and indeed the Kahnemannian text which I've set you are really not straightforward. They're quite tricky. And we've covered just like a ton of complex philosophical ideas. So if your head is spinning right now, that is completely normal. If these ideas are new to you, there's so much here that probably there's a lot going on for you in your head right now. It's going to be challenging. Secondly, I want to reassure you about the direction of this course. So we've deliberately gone in at the deep end into the philosophical space because these ideas are big, they're foundational, and we need to understand them. We need to kind of know where research is coming out from, what it's built upon. But we're starting at an abstract level, and we're definitely going to get into more concrete things as we move forward. So the entire course isn't going to be like this. Indeed, this is probably the deepest and most philosophical thing that we're going to do. And we're going to look at more concrete things as we move forward. But to do that, it's important that we have a working knowledge of this philosophy. And part of that is the language and the words that we're using. You're going to come across a lot of these words again and again in your readings. And you're also going to need to learn and be able to use these words when you're giving your research proposal at the end of the module. So to help you get to know them, I posted this grid, which you can see on the screen now, into a forum on Moodle. And I want you to go away and I want you to pick a few of these terms, perhaps things that are completely new or things that are completely unclear to you. And I want you to do a bit of research yourself. I want you to start to think about what do these words mean? How can you understand them? It might be that you document your thought process, that you didn't understand it or you understood it in one way and then you looked at it again, you understood it in a different way. That's fine. I just want you to think through the process. Then I'd like you to post onto Moodle your understanding of some of these words. It might be something like a causation or correlation. It could be something like epistemology. So pick a word, unpack it for us. The next thing just to stress is that you're not on your own with this. We're going to be having regular online face-to-face sessions where we can discuss and recap these ideas. I'm also really happy to take points from you, so if you want to post in the forums, that can be really powerful, or equally if you want to direct message me, that's also fine. So really, please do use those Moodle forums. Don't feel that you're lost. If this is completely over your head at this point in time, that's absolutely fine. Don't stress, don't worry, don't be concerned. We've got time to talk about it. And it's fine for you if you feel like you've got the broad contours, but a lot of the language is still above you. That's also absolutely fine. So my final thing is this. I'm guessing that some of you might have come into this particular unit going, I know I want to research. I know what my project's going to be, and I've got an idea how I want to research. And that's fine. And it's really good, actually. And I want you to hold on to that passion. But thinking about the purpose of this course, as you've seen, hopefully just from these first 2 weeks, we're going to dig in quite deep into what research is. And that means that some of the ideas you might have about your research at this point could be challenged. So for that reason, whilst having ideas about your research is absolutely fine, I just want you to step back a little bit and be aware that things can shift and change, and that's fine. So don't be fixed in your ideas about the research you might like to do. Perhaps have an idea of what it is that you'd like to research, but keep flexible about how you might go about doing that research so that we can shape it as we get new ideas. Anyway, I want to thank you for your focus, for listening to this. I know it's not been easy. I know there's probably a lot of hard work going on in your brain. I'm really looking forward to seeing everybody in our face-to-face session and to hearing your questions and your contributions in the forums. So looking forward to that first live session, and I'll speak to you all very, very soon. You take care. Bye.